there is this issue around sort of masculinity and what's perceived as being manly, and you're not a man, and if they're assaulted they may react in a physical way that makes them think, oh, I must have enjoyed it, or I can't admit that to anybody because it's so embarrassing.
Working with male survivors, especially if they've been anally raped, when that happens they will get a physical reaction, they will get an erection, they may even climax. And this can be very, very confusing for them because they may feel somehow it's been pleasurable when it's not, it's just the physical reaction the body has. And that may be very confusing to them about their sexuality. They may even feel somehow, does that mean I'm gay? They're very, very confused about it, especially if it happened when they're young. And sometimes these, especially young men, can be very, very disruptive behaviour or very withdrawn because they really have severe trauma. And I don't think this is often understood by people who have never worked in this area, what actually can happen.
I think typically people expect this to be a crime that is perpetrated by adult men against young girls. But more and more we are starting to realise that that's not necessarily the case. So we are seeing more slowly starting to see young boys coming through as victims. They're very underrepresented within our data sets, and we know that they're underrepresented compared to some of the national work that Barnardo's have done in terms of young boys that are accessing their services. We know that we're not seeing as many as we should. And when we've done pieces of work with professionals, social workers, other people, we know that there is still a tendency to see boys as victims of other forms of exploitation, so criminal perhaps, or being involved with gangs, less likely to recognise that sexual element. I think we've talked a lot about some of the challenges around disclosure for young people, but when we think about that in the context of boys and young men, it's even more complex. They're worried about people casting assertions on their sexuality and them being very uncomfortable with that. They are worried about people not seeing them as real men. And society has a lot to answer for, really, in both of those issues, in the expectations that we put on boys and young men of how to be a man, what it means to be a man, that are really unhelpful and quite damaging. So if you think about the media and the way that media portray young men who are sexually abused by their female teachers, and some of the commentary that goes around that, well, you know, if that was me, isn't he lucky, she's fit, it's not a problem, what's he moaning for? That sort of commentary is very unlikely to lead a young boy to think that they can disclose. They may not actually see themselves as being a victim in that situation at all. Even if they feel that it wasn't right, that it wasn't okay, they might feel very traumatised, but actually be very confused then, because everybody in society is telling them that they're not a victim, that they should have enjoyed it, that it should be okay. So there's a number of more complex issues, I think, around boys and young men. They're more likely to come through the criminal justice route. There is something about the way in which boys display their trauma. So young females are more likely to internalise that, whereas young boys are more likely to be aggressive, to be hostile, to be angry, and actually that impacts on professionals' protective attitudes towards them. So they're more likely to see them as troublemakers, less likely to recognise the potential for victimhood within that.
It's something that we're seeing as an emerging issue around boys and young men is the increase in younger young men who are being groomed and exploited by offenders to carry out sexual offences against other young people. So, for example, you might have, I'll use the example in a gang situation, you might have a young man who is part of a gang who, as part of his initiation, for example, is forced to have sex with another young person or other young people, male or female. Part of that is to cement their status within the gang, but there's also something in there around the power and control of the gang and the power and control element of that. And also, it's also likely that continuing that gang involvement will encourage that young person to, or will force that young person into committing other sexual offences moving forward against other young people. And I think also we've seen it not just in gang situations where boys and young men have been groomed and exploited by adults to kind of be the hook to start the grooming process with other girls. So it could be, for example, quite an attractive looking 17-year-old male who's kind of groomed by older adults to encourage young people to believe that they're in a relationship with him, and he will then pass those young people on to be abused by older adults. And I think there's a really close link and something we need to be really mindful of around some of the young men that are committing some of these sexually exploitative behaviours and sexual offending behaviours are actually victims of grooming and exploitation themselves. And it's about how we manage the complexities around these abused recruiters or abused offenders, and the fact that yes, they're sex offenders potentially, but actually first and foremost they're children and victims themselves quite often. So there's something there, I think, about boys and young men that's often slightly different to girls. It's very rare that we see girls groomed into committing sexual offences. We might see girls groomed into introducing peers or other young girls into exploitation, but we rarely see them being groomed and exploited into committing sexual offences. So I think there's something there around how we manage that. And it's something that we're getting a lot better at. I think the criminal justice agencies, particularly the police, are getting a lot better at considering the potential for an offender in terms of what their victim, whether they're potentially victims as well, with females and with males, because historically somebody over the age of 18 who was engaged in committing sexual assaults and sexual exploitation related offences would automatically be assumed as being a bad guy. But actually, and they, don't get me wrong, they're committing offences, they're committing sexual offences, they are a bad guy, but actually there might be something there around their kind of grooming and exploitation that they've experienced as well. And again, particularly in gang situations where young people who are in gangs are more likely to be vulnerable to wider forms of exploitation, so criminal exploitation and as well as the sexual exploitation. Essentially they're viewed as a commodity, so they will be used in as many ways as they can be to make money. And that will include the boys being involved in recruiting other young men and also more likely young women into sexual exploitation for that reason.